All right, let's get started. Dennis, do you see that? Okay, just making sure.
Yes, I am here, and hello, everyone. Hey, we want to thank everyone for tuning in today for second session of our series, in which Brother Salaam and Brother Brown they truly blessed us on Wednesday. For those of you present on Wednesday, I know that you had got a great meal, and right now you're about to get the dessert to that meal. Um, and I really don't want to take up too much of their time, but we want to just thank all of you guys for tuning in and again continue to join this series. And at this time, I want to just turn it over to Brother Mike Brown and Brother Sundiata Salaam.
All right, thank you, Dennis. Really appreciate that. I am Sundiata Salaam, Chief People Officer at Freedom Prep Academy, which is a charter network in Memphis, Tennessee. And so we found out from a lot of you, from our Pittsburgh folks, that y'all are dealing with below freezing, and right now it's 51 degrees, feels like 59 outside here. And I'm not bragging. But that's just what we're dealing with here in Memphis right now. And Mike, you want to introduce yourself, sir?
Yes, it's great to see you guys again. I'm Mike Brown, Memphis, Tennessee, the Executive Director of the Freedom Fellows Institute, training leaders to become school founders. And it's wonderful to be with you guys again. And yes, it is much warmer here in Memphis. And so we'll try to send some of y'all that warm weather that we have on this side.
Good deal. All right. So you're going to have, here's the thing, before you get into this, Mike does all of these word scrambles, and I was trying to get them today, and I was like, what in the world is this? So here's your goal. Within 90 seconds, you are to unscramble these words, remembering that the capital letters don't necessarily mean anything. So just because a letter is capital does not mean it is the first letter in the triangle. It could be anywhere within that particular word. But for those of you who have been on our sessions, think about our sessions, and these words have a lot to do with the session that we've done. If you haven't been, good luck. So I'm gonna count. You're gonna have 90 seconds. What I don't want everyone putting the answers in the chat all at once, because I want people to make sure they get it. And so there'll be a moment where I say, if you have the answers, go ahead and put them in. And you put all of them in at the same time. For Zoom purposes, you cannot type something in and hit enter and skip a space. If you type it in and hit enter, it will send it out. And so you want to make sure that you just type it in, comma, type with the other one in as well. And we'll see who can get all four of these words. And then we'll talk a little bit about it at that point. Good deal? All right, 90 seconds on the clock. Let's go.
Salaam, we'll see if they get hung up on the same one you got hung up on.
All of them? I'm still struggling with one of them, and I've seen them 2 or 3 times. Y'all, we're at about 40 seconds.
I think the average person will be able to get, I think they'll be able to get 3 out of 4.
2.
That's an I, by the way.
Oh, yes, that's an I on the ISAB. That's I, Basil. And you cheating. Not yet, Kareem. You're not supposed to put it in yet. All right, y'all. In about 10 seconds, I'm going to have people put them in. 8, 7. It's not labs. 6, 5, 4.
It's an I.
2, 1. If you want to put answers in, go ahead, please. Luann from last time, she got it great. Luann, right? Stephanie, right? There's 2 Stephanie. Stephanie Edwards, right? Stephanie Connolly, right? Destiny. Okay, Destiny with an I, right?
Jalen has 1.
Hosea.
Alexandra has 2.
Yep. Alexandra got 2.
Yeah, I'm going to give y'all some clues. Try it now. Up.
Oh, come on, Claire.
Clara almost had it. She had 3 out of 4.
Look at that, Justin.
Justin.
Good job, Justin. That's hilarious.
All right, so I think Clara got
Oh, come on, Kareem.
people couldn't get that one. Good
I didn't
job.
get that one. So we've gotten, people have gotten all of them at this point. And so
Excellent job.
bias, discomfort, impact, and narrative. And so all of these things are going to be something that we talk about and you're going to have to deal with today. Let's immediately talk about bias, right? Which sometimes is a word that make people immediately go to defense. And they immediately are like, I don't have a bias. Bias is not something that I have. We all have bias. And yes, there are ranges in terms of how your bias affects things systemically, but all of us have bias. And so when you do feel a little bit of discomfort, see, I'm using the words in the triangle. When you feel a little discomfort because your bias is being exposed, please deal with that discomfort and let it go by. You have to have the discomfort in order to be able to do the work and let those biases come out. We all have a narrative, and whether we know it or not, we all have impact. I remember when I first started schooling and started doing things with culture, people would say, if you don't set the culture, they will set the culture. And so if you are not thinking that you have an impact is always being felt. And so you will always have an impact, and these things can be determined by them. All right. Am I just reading these, Mike?
Yes.
Yep. Okay. And so I'm going to read.
We could possibly have people read them if they're able to.
That's right. That's right. Yes. What I'm going to do is this. I'm going to read the first one. What we would typically do in this, you all, the reason it says in this corner is that we would put people in 4 corners of the room based on which one stands out to them the most. But we're going to read these. I'm going to read number 1, and after I finish, while I'm reading number 1, I want people in the attendees to raise their hand because I'm going to need a reader for 2, 3, and 4. If you don't raise your hand, I'm a school teacher, so I will call on you. But as I'm reading number 1, raise your hand, and I will call on you to read 2, 3, and 4. I believe that's possible, Kari, and correct me if I'm wrong. Number 1, it took an educational effort that was systematic, intensive, and unparalleled to erase these memories and to cloud the vision among African Americans. Once reference points were lost, African Americans as a people became like a computer without a program, a space without a homing device, a dependent without a benefactor. No one raised a hand. Oh, we got a hand raised. Michelle, please read number 2 for us. Thank you, Michelle.
Michelle, you're allowed to talk.
Okay. Michelle, before you talk, who I would like to go next, Michelle. So Michelle, you'll go number 2. Kari, if you don't mind reading number 3, and Destiny with an I, if you can read number 4, that would be great.
All right, can you all hear me?
Yes, we can.
All right, awesome. The first lesson in the humanities is to make people aware of their own contributions to civilization. And the second lesson is to teach them about other civilizations and with proper appraisal. And so
before you read number 3, you all, as you're reading this, I want you to take this in as well. I know we're on Zoom, but really take in what is being said. And we don't want to just read it just for information's sake. Also, let it sit with you and see where what you feel from that. Go ahead.
I would love to add this on to number 2. I know that as teachers, we tend to say, what subject do you teach? I teach ELA or I teach history, and a flip side of looking at that, is I teach students. And the goal is, as a teacher, no matter what your subject is, the goal is to know your students and their people as much as you know your subject. And unfortunately, when we go to college, to get our teacher credentials, they require that we learn science, but don't require that we learn about people. And so teaching science in the African-American community should be different than teaching science in the white community or in the heavy Latino or indigenous community. So let's get in the habit of learning our people or learning the people that we serve just as much as we learn the subject.
Yeah, it's not just science, just social studies. There's a bias that goes between all those subjects. And so what Mike said is extremely important. Number 3.
Latino and Black students who don't know our history are injured in the most fragile parts of the psyche. Lacking reinforcement in their own historical experience, they become psychologically crippled, hobbling along in the margins of European experiences.
Beautiful. Number 4, Destiny.
The thought of the inferiority of the Negro is drilled into him in almost every class he enters and in almost every book he studies.
Beautiful.
And unfortunately, you know, these were written at a time and by authors, who were writing in the 50s, 60s, 30s, some of them. But now, if you think about just different, marginalized groups of color in America, this is the same for our Indigenous Americans. This is the same for our Latinx students and families. And it's a shame that as people of color come to this country, they all have to go through the same dehumanization, not just in society, but also in school. And it's got to stop somewhere. And there's no better people to talk to about stopping it other than teachers who have a chance to stand in front of students for 8 hours to educate them. And it's interesting because we're not, as educators, as teachers, we're not the only ones who have to deal with this. And so you recognize this gentleman in front of you, Albert Einstein. He also had to deal with this. Now, mind you, Albert Einstein was coming from what country? If somebody could jump off mute, you could say, what country was Albert Einstein living in?
Or write it in the chat as well. I think Kari has to give them permission to be able to talk.
Got you. Then that makes sense. Then I'll move on. Albert Einstein coming from Germany. During the time of the Holocaust, Albert Einstein was Jewish. And the only reason why he was not put in concentration camps was because he was a scientist and had something to get to the scientific community. And so therefore he was being used by the Nazis to actually improve Germany's science. But it was when Albert Einstein escaped Germany and came to America that he had this thought. And it says, there is, however, a somber point in the social outlook of Americans. Their sense of equality and human dignity is mainly limited to men of white skin, men specifically of white skin. Even among these, there are prejudices of which I, as a Jew, am clearly conscious, but they are unimportant in comparison with the attitude of the whites towards their fellow citizens of darker complexion, particularly toward Negroes. The more I feel an American, the more the situation pains me. And Albert Einstein's response is this: I can escape the feeling of complicity in it only by speaking out. And so if you don't look like the students that you predominantly teach, take a note from Albert Einstein, who was also white, and in this American context said, I see the mistreatment and the inequalities towards people of color. And he said, the only way I can escape this feeling of being a part of it and being complicit is to speak out. So to our teachers, our white teachers specifically, the same thing. The only way you can not be complicit is to speak out in the classroom. And for our teachers of color who are on this call, there's one thing, and Salaam has dealt with this before, and for those of you on this call that might have led some equity work at your schools and your classrooms, you might have felt the same way. But I realized that when we're doing equity sessions, a lot of times the white teachers will feel nervous because we're going to confront bias. But the black and brown teachers are like, well, good, I just want you to say it so the white teachers can get it. And the black and brown teachers are sitting back, in equity class, just sitting back like, I know this all. And that's not the case. That is not the case. So the way Alice Walker says, she says, when the axe came into the forest, the tree said, the handle is one of us. And so if you could think about that, internalize that, what this basically says is, it doesn't matter whether you come in white skin, black skin, or brown skin, we've all been educated in America, which means we've all internalized the same biases. And if we as black and brown educators do not do some hard work and grapple with the biases that we learned about our own people and about other people of color, then we will actually do the same damage that others have done to our people. And so no one comes ready for this work. And I promise you, the reason why we do these sessions, especially the reason why we dive into curriculum, is because if we teach exactly what was taught to us, then I promise you, our black and brown kids that we teach now will be feeding them the same poison that we ourselves learned in school. And they, just like us at 20 and 21 years old, will be in college trying to find ourselves through identity, because of what our teachers never taught us when we were young. And so this work is not just for white educators. This is for all educators, including the educators who look like the kids we teach. This hard work is for all of us. And in diving into, in Wednesday's session, we went right into curriculum. Why? Because it's PD. And I know that when we're teachers in PD, the first thing we want to know is, how can I change my lessons for the next day? And so that's what we want to give you. And we're going to give you a little bit more of that today, especially for those who are science teachers. But there are some things that we wanted to go over and talk about just to make sure that we're not just kind of talking about surface things of curriculum, but we're also talking about why we got to this place. One of my good friends, Dr. Shondell Whitley, he's the founder of the Teach, Hustle, and Inspire movement. I don't know if some of you have heard that, but he talked to me, we were talking this morning, and his statement to me was, Brown, he said, while we're doing professional development, he says we have to make sure that we're doing personal development, because there is no professional development if there's no personal development. And which is having that conversation, it really moved us to say we have to keep talking about the inner person before or along with talking about the curriculum that we teach.
Beautiful.
And so in this specifically, there's a gentleman named Richard Rothstein, and he wrote, I think it was 2 years ago, The Color of Law. And it really goes in depth about how inequalities were built up in this country. Because here's the thing, when we're teaching Black and brown kids, we look at, mostly low income, we're looking at them being in hard situations. But if we don't ever understand how they really got there, then we'll walk into a classroom as a teacher and just believe that it was a lack of education that put them in a situation of being, I'm in a second-class citizenship economically, or it's because their families didn't care about education, or because somebody in their family didn't work hard, and that's why, they're having free and reduced lunch. And these are all inaccurate. And so once again, as we're teaching kids of color, we also have to learn about how our students got to where they are. And this will just shed some light just on a few of those things. I'm going to have Salaam read a few.
Absolutely. So one, in absolute terms, the median white household had 111,146 in wealth holdings in 2011, compared to 7,113 for the median Black household and 8,348 for the median Latino household. The source is the U.S. Census Bureau Survey of Income and Program Participation.
And these are the numbers. And once again, if you don't understand how this happened, you might make the mistake and believe that white families are just working harder than Black and brown families. And that is not the case.
Yeah. Under the FHA government program, 98% of all home loans throughout the country from 1934 to 1968 were given to white families. 98%. For the first 30 years of the program, Congress granted $120 billion of government-backed money for white Americans who could not afford homes. So
once again, it was never called welfare. It was called the FHA government program. And I don't know, and right now I benefit from the FHA loan from my first house. And some of you have as well. Well, for the first 30 years of existence, it was given to white people only. And so think about it, the first time the government offers money for homes. Remember, the government has always been in the business of helping people. Always. And so anytime people start talking about when the government helps people, it's welfare, that's a lie. It only became welfare, the term welfare and the connotation of welfare, when it began to be Black and brown people. All right. The government has always been in the business of helping people. FHA loan was one of those ways, but they only gave it to white people. And that allowed white people, for the first time who could not afford it, to buy homes. And $120 billion of government money went into that. And it was not given to any Black or brown people. So now when we look at what we call the suburbs, and we look at these bigger houses, and we look at these homes, and they happen to be white people only, this is not because there was a group that worked hard and a group that didn't. This was literally subsidized by the government and created. I think someone has a hand.
Yep, before number 3, Susan Farmer raised her hand. And y'all, we appreciate the sort of participation this way.
Absolutely.
So feel free, raise your hand, and Karee, and you can let them talk. That would be great. One other thing before she talks, we didn't say this. We I think began assuming that everyone here was here last time. If you're not here from last time, this presentation is called Culture Killing, and it's the death of marginalized cultures in the education curriculum. So that's a lot of what we'll be getting into. And I believe it was Shirley Rossi who had her hand raised. Or Susan. Yes, Susan Farmer. Go ahead, Susan.
Uh-oh.
She may have changed her mind.
Karee, is she able to?
She's talking for me.
It's up to you. It's up to her.
Oh,
Susan.
Okay,
Susan said, "Too much pressure. Too much pressure." Susan, I'm gonna go ahead and read number. I'm gonna go ahead and read number 3. Susan, and if you want to talk, just let us know in the chat. Number 3, African Americans and Latinos were far more likely to be denied conventional mortgages than whites, even when income, loan size, and other factors were taken into account. The study examined 31 million mortgage records and found disturbing evidence in 61 metropolitan areas.
Once again, this is not a matter of intelligence or who works harder.
Yeah. And while the Fair Housing Act was passed in 1968, the highest number of discrimination complaints based on race was 38 years later in 2006.
Right. So once again, so we're looking at our schools and we're thinking about why are the wealthier schools and the wealthier suburbs predominantly white schools, and why are the inner city, predominantly black and brown? These are the reasons why.
Absolutely.
So what implicit biases might we harbor regarding our growing Spanish populations? And so for those who are teaching, a number of Latinx students, we also want to talk about some of the things in their culture and some of the things that they're wrestling with today, and some of the misinformation that's been out there. And so the first thing is this: all history teachers have seen this first picture, have taught this first picture. This is about the mass waves of immigration, European immigration coming to America, and this was, starting in the 1819. There was another one in the 1830s and 1840s, especially, leaving, war-torn countries during the world wars. And it's interesting because as a former history teacher, we celebrate these migration movements. As a matter of fact, this is also the chapter, in case you don't know, this is also a chapter where the Statue of Liberty is there. And we talk about the poem by Emma Lazarus that's at the bottom of the Statue of Liberty. And it says, give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to be free. So we talk about how America became a welcoming place for immigrants. That's what we've always been about, until those immigrants became black and brown. And so now, when we're looking at the news, especially in the last administration, the last few years, we look at these Latinx families coming over from Central and South America, and people are like, well, why are they coming here? And we're questioning their motives for coming to America, where, we talk negatively about it when they're coming looking for a better life. We question their motives, we call them criminals. And so there's been a serious shift in the way people have looked at immigration in this country. But here's the thing: the reasons why they come to America is not different. And so if the reasons are not different, then the only difference that we're talking about is race. That is what's made a different case for why, or for how we treat immigration in this country. But here are some of the historical statistics behind the misinformation that's been out there. And if you're teaching Latino students, I want you to know this, because while we might not be spreading lies, when we hear it enough, just through the nature of how bias works, we hear it enough, we begin to internalize those things at the same time. And when Latino kids come in our class, we begin to think that we have to fix broken kids or broken families, and they are not broken at all, but the system they're coming into is broken.
40% of undocumented residents never walked across any border but overstayed their work visa. Disproportionately, they are Canadian and European, not Mexican.
But it's interesting because whenever we talk about immigration, the immigration problem, we've never talked about the immigrants coming from Europe and not from Mexico and Central America. And the fact that we've been building up walls and talking about closing the border when almost half of the immigration does not walk across a border. Mm-hmm. So when they're talking about killing immigration, the slowing immigration, they're only talking about for certain people. And that's the system that our Latino students are unfortunately having to battle through.
And as a percentage of their respective populations, there were 56% fewer criminal convictions of illegal immigrants than of native-born Americans in Texas in 2015. The criminal conviction rate for legal immigrants was about 85% below the native-born rate.
So once again, the amount of bias and negativity that we've heard against the Latinx community, we have to let you hear the positive. We have to let you hear the truth, even more than the bias, because whatever you hear most is what will stick with you. And If you need to see that for my math and my science people who need to see graphs, here's a scatter plot that shows a negative correlation between increased immigration and crime. To give an example, if it was a positive correlation, that would basically say the more immigration there is, the more crime. The less immigration, the less crime. There is a negative correlation, which means that in cities with the highest amount of immigration, especially Mexican and Central American, the crime is actually lower, not higher. And these are data points to battle against the negative bias that we hear about the communities that and the families that our students come from. This is Stephen Goss. He is the chief actuary of the Social Security Administration for our country. So he's the chief actuary, top dog. So this is what he says about economics for immigrants, especially coming from Central and South America.
And so he says, Stephen Goss, the chief actuary of the Social Security Administration, explained that an estimated 7 million people are currently working in the U.S. illegally. Of those, he estimates that about 3.1 million are using fake or expired Social Security numbers, yet also paying automatic payroll taxes. Goss believes that these workers pay an annual net contribution of $12 billion to the Social Security Trust Fund. The SSA estimates that unauthorized workers have paid a whopping $100 billion into the fund over the past decade. Yet, as they are in the U.S. illegally, it is unlikely that they will be able to benefit from their contributions later in life. Although undocumented, they have taxes automatically taken out of their checks like any other employee. That money then goes to the federal treasury to fund programs like Social Security and Medicare. And for the next slide that's coming up, if anyone else wants to read, go ahead and raise your hand so Karika know to take you off mute. And not if anyone, please, we would love for other people to read as well and to be engaged. And so those who want to take your, raise your hand so we can get you off mute.
And so if you look at the title of this slide, it says, there are no freeloaders.
Right.
And so for anybody who thinks that we have, that there are immigrants coming from Central South America and living off of the system, and that's an absolute lie. No one ever talks about the $100 billion that they put in over the last 10 years that they will never have access to. But when they put that money into our treasury, we are able to benefit from it in Social Security, Medicare. And so if anyone is using the money off of someone else, it is definitely not them using our money. This is what our families are doing. Do we have any readers?
That's what I was waiting to see. Any raised hands? Going once. One raised hand. Let's go, S. Johnson. You can go ahead and read the. Matter of fact, since you are so brave, I'm going to have you read the first two boxes, please.
Okay, African Americans and Latinos were far more likely to be denied conventional mortgages than whites, even when income, loan size, and other factors were taken into account. The study examined 31 million mortgage records and found disturbing evidence in 61 metropolitan areas. Through local ballots, 74% of Americans say they want to raise the minimum wage. However, legislators in states have passed preemption bills to block cities and counties from passing their own minimum wage hikes.
This is why our school, I'm sorry, go ahead, Salaam.
No, go ahead, please.
I was gonna say, this is why in our communities, there's so many kids who are dependent on free and reduced lunch, not because people are not working hard. This is legislation. These are legislative decisions. Yeah.
And the last two, ProPublica published an April 2017 analysis showing premiums and payouts in California, Illinois, Texas, and Missouri, where Geico, Liberty Mutual, and Allstate charged minority neighborhoods as much as 30% more than other areas with similar accidents. And Latinos are less likely to have jobs that include employer-sponsored health care, a retirement plan, or paid time off.
Once again, they said they're less likely to have jobs. It said they're less likely to have jobs where the company is providing these things. Once again, these are not individual decisions from the families of the kids that we serve. These are legislative decisions. And for our, and I don't know what the population of your school, but for our African immigrants who are coming, these are some of the statistics about some of our African immigrants. Salaam, if you can read this with them.
I'll be happy to. Yep. The report found that African immigrants were significantly more likely to have graduate degrees. A total of 16% had a master's degree, medical degree, law degree, or a doctorate, compared with 11% of the U.S.-born population. African immigrants were more than twice as likely than the U.S. population overall to work in healthcare, Lim said. There are more than 32,500 nursing, psychiatric, or home health aides, more than 46,000 registered nurses, and more than 15,700 doctors and surgeons.
All right. Thank you. And someone asked a question about, like, if people do come in legally, should they benefit, from breaking the law? The whole idea about breaking the law, immigration, and once again, some of these are political discussions. What's not a political discussion is the fact that they're paying $100 billion into our system. That's not political, that's a fact. What is a fact is that, that 40% never come across the border. So those are not political issues, but those are facts. But a political issue is when we talk about European immigrants coming, especially, in the early 20th century, there was no idea of legal or illegal immigration. There was the idea people came to the country, we put them through a process in which they became naturalized citizens. That only changed, once again, when the people coming over changed. And so the fact that we're able to say illegal immigrant now, we could not say, if that's the case, if we apply that same logic, then all of the Europeans that came over in the early 1918, they would have also been illegal as well. But we did not call them illegal. We put them through a naturalization process and we brought them into the American system. And so political or not political, that is the idea.
Yeah, to your point, and we've used the term illegal immigrants here because for various reasons. But what has ended up happening is even though you just put that a massive amount of illegal immigrants come from Europe and Canada, when the question is asked about illegal immigrants and breaking the law, we all know who the first people we think about are. And so what ends up happening also is illegal immigrants becomes a sort of hash or catch-all for really saying Mexicans. Yes. And those who are, because we're assuming that they're benefiting from us, but we're not benefiting from them. Which in and of itself, that foundation, that basis is based on a race idea that the European immigrants who are coming illegally are not doing the exact same thing, and that they're not benefiting from us, we're benefiting from them, which is, to your point, Mike, that is the case, right? We believe that when these people were coming, we could benefit from them. The whole idea and concept of America was the e pluribus unum, right? Out of one, many, right? This idea, the idea of having the Statue of Liberty, people coming over to a place and seeing freedom, and that we would benefit from what it is that they had to bring. Yet, when those people began to be non-people of European descent, suddenly that idea became a little bit more far-fetched.
Absolutely. And so when it comes to teaching, our students of color, there are just kind of three basic kind of tenets that we think about and we operate from. The first one is that all marginalized communities have a story, so learn it. And so as a teacher and, in a community, especially when I'm predominantly teaching students who are not directly from my group, their community has a story. Before I sit there and think about what science I'm going to teach them or what history I'm going to teach them or what ELA I'm going to teach them, what books I choose, I need to learn their story. And so a way to do that is create space and opportunity. We talked about family forums, informal. We talked about making school a community meeting space where people from the community can come in and meet and use the building. And I promise you, in my context, I was teaching, a few years ago, I was teaching at a school where it's predominantly students from Dominican Republic. We had Vietnamese, we had Cambodian students, we had West African students, East African, Sudanese students, and literally just having their families and community members have meetings in our school building. As the administrator in the building, I would just sit in on the meetings. I would just sit there and I learned so much about the people that we were serving just by being there and just being in their space or opening up our space for them, but not being an administrator, but just kind of being a part of the community. Which leads into the second part of how do you learn their stories. You build authentic relationships. And there's a quote on here that says, basically, be a member, not a missionary. Be a member of the community, not a missionary. It is so sexy for us to come in as teachers with our degrees and then come into a community and say we're their teacher. Then we go to their baseball games and we support them in their cheerleading. But like we kind of walk in and walk out like superstars almost, But the idea is, and then we go out and we brag to our friends about how much we do for our kids. As if their parents and community needed us. What their parents and community need is they need for the marginal restrictions to be lifted off their community, not saviors. They don't need anybody to come and save them. All we can do, or the best we can do as teachers, is fight the system that marginalizes our students. If we fight the system that marginalizes our students, one day we won't have marginalized students to teach. That's the goal. Our goal is not to keep saving people who need help. Our goal is to break the system and allow the kids and families to rise to their greatness that they would normally rise to without the restrictions. The next thing is, and this is for our ELA teachers specifically, now literature people, create what we call a textual lineage. And I got this term from Dr. Alfred Tatum. And basically Dr. Alfred Tatum says, you should look at the students who you teach, think about their cultures, learn about their cultures, and then start to pull a number of texts from different people from these communities, since, as far back as you can go, that help this group of people to understand their identity, to understand their history, to understand their greatness, to understand their belief systems. And then you provide all these books and allow kids and expose kids to these books. So therefore, they're not just reading books, they're not just learning the literature, but they're also learning about who they are as people from others in that same group. And so the way Tatum says it is, what community of elders, scholars, and authors and educators are helping you as teachers, helping us make sense of the past and how we got to this moment? And so if I'm teaching predominantly Dominican students, I need to be learning and reading Dominican and Latinx authors who have been making sense of their experience in America, not going by what other Black or white people have said about Dominicans and then teach Dominicans. I need to go to Dominicans and learn what their people have said about their culture.
Now, if this is one of my favorite movies and movie scenes, and this is interesting because One Night in Miami has recently been coming about, and people have been talking about the gentleman who played Malcolm X on there, and no one played Malcolm X better than Malcolm X himself played Malcolm X to me than Denzel Washington. And this scene is extremely important for what we're about to talk about. If those remember, I believe Malcolm was in Cambridge, and he was giving a speech, or he was doing a debate at that time period. And he's walking, and Spike Lee has the special music that he has, and the camera's moving. And this young white lady comes up to him and says, she said, I heard what you had to say. I thought it was so true. I really appreciated it. I really enjoyed it. And she gives this long speech of how much she was impacted by what Malcolm X had to say. And then she asked him a question. She says, and what can I do? What can I do to assist in this? And Malcolm looks at her for a moment and he says, nothing. And he walks off. And for those of us who have just seen the movie, you see that scene and you say, wow, and then you see the other things that happen in the movie. Those of us who have read the autobiography of Malcolm X, he specifically talks about this moment later on in life. There's two moments he talks about. He says this moment, he said, I wish that I would have said something else to her. I wish I would have told her that there was actually something she could do. And there's another moment in Malcolm X, autobiography of Malcolm X, I believe it's in the epilogue, where he's with Alex Haley and they're driving and a gentleman pulls up next to them. And it was a white man. And he says to Malcolm, he says, I hear you speak. And he says, I hope your people listen to you because you are really telling the truth. I really like what you have to say. And Malcolm looks at the man and says, I wish I had a group of white people that were similar to you that could work with other white people in this area. And then he looks at Alex Haley and says, don't record that right now and don't put that down, right? But he had an idea of how people who, in our case, who don't look like the students that they work with, how they could be involved in terms of dealing with marginalized communities.
And at the same time, during the time period that we call the civil rights movement, this is Julian Bond, and this is a group called SNCC. SNCC was a civil rights group, and SNCC's approach to the exact same question of what can white teachers or white leaders and white citizens do to really kind of fight back against the inequality that was going on. And while Malcolm X at the time said nothing, SNCC and Julian Bond said, just as Malcolm X said later on in his life, your number one thing, he said, the number one job, number one role of white people in this movement is not to have kumbaya moments with Black people. It's not to say I want to be an ally and tell Black people how much you support them. The number one role of white people is to talk to your people. And so the idea is like to talk to those people who you had the voice of to try to make change. Your number one job is to talk to other white people. And so in that, this is coming off of, and this is a review of what we did on Wednesday. So once again, how do you bring all that into the classroom, all that knowledge, all that information, they're breaking down the bias? And to someone's question earlier, it says, well, how do you change the national curriculum to put all this in it? So here's the thing, there is no national curriculum. There is no national curriculum. There's no such thing. And I thank God about it. I thank God for that. There's no national curriculum. There are standards. There are standards. Remember, curriculum are the materials that you use to teach something. And there is no national curriculum set that every teacher in the country has to teach. So there's no national curriculum. But there are standards. There are Common Core in some states. And in most states have their own set of standards that are very, very Common Core like. And so the goal is, well, if kids have to test according to the standards, then then the real question is, how can we take the standards that are not culturally relevant? They're not. The standards that are not culturally relevant, how can we take those state standards and then make them culturally relevant and teach Black and brown and white kids more culturally relevant lessons while still attacking the standards to make sure that kids are learning and they're able to master standards. And so once again, here are the strategies that we kind of rolled out. And we'll just fly through them again. Number one was selecting culturally relevant text, empowering text. Remember, these are from the easiest to the more complex strategies to use. And so just be honest once again about where you are in education. If you are new to your curriculum, if you are new to teaching math, I don't want you to jump to number 6 and say, I'm going to do the most complex culturally relevant strategy. Start with number 1 or number 2. But if you're well-versed in your subject and been teaching it for a while, then of course, please go down to the more complex strategies. Number 2 is problem solving for real world issues affecting students and communities. So when you're able to look at your lessons and you're able to talk about how can we connect this to real world problems, that is a culturally relevant move. Like a lot of times what you see people doing is like, once again, if they're doing it in math and they're studying angles, I've seen people say, look, we talk about this neighborhood or this city block that looks a mess, that has, dilapidated housing on it. If we were to blow that block up using these mathematical angles, how many houses can we put in there? What would be the shapes? And how can we redesign this block geometrically to look like a beautiful block that we would brag about in our community? That is how you kind of look at doing problem solving for real world issues, using context or using school content. Number 3, renaming for historical accuracy. So once you kind of, remember, or once you kind of learn the true history behind some of our academic content, you can have fun with it and start to rename some of these things. So we talked about, Mrs. Salaam, when we used the math example on Wednesday's session, whose theorem did we rename for more historical accuracy?
The Pythagorean theorem.
All right. Knowing that, remember that that Pythagoras studied in Egypt and Northern Africa in the temples of Waret and Waset. He studied there for 22 years. And that's where he learned the theorem. And so he could not be there learning a theorem but it's one that he created. He did not create the theorem. The theorem was being used to build pyramids 1,230 something years before Pythagoras was ever born. And so the Pythagorean theorem is what he learned, not what he created. And so while our kids know how to do the Pythagorean theorem, we would allow them to rename it and give it different names to be more historically accurate. Number 4, your do-nows, changing your do-nows for cultural context. And so when you get your standard and you create your objectives, then you say, what is the first 10 minutes that I can do in a class to actually give them a culturally sound moment, to where before we get into the lesson, we can teach them where the history of this came from. All right. Number 5, recreating text for cultural accuracy and connection. This is a very, very, once again, tedious task. You're studying history from other texts, but then you're looking at what the textbook has. You're like, this is inaccurate, or this is not enough. This does not represent all the different cultures that are in there. So therefore, we actually go and we retype and we recreate text, adding these other facts, these other historical facts in there to make it more accurate. Salaam, you laughed at something. What was it?
I was laughing at the question that wasn't really a question that said, are you serious? That sounds like absolute nonsense. And so I laughed at that statement.
Which one was that?
Someone just put that in the question and answers. It's the same person who was saying about...
Got you.
Yeah, the national curriculum and all those different things, yeah.
And number 6, reworking objectives to include real world and cultural connections. So once again, when you're really, really strong at this, you can take your objectives and completely rework your objectives to make sure that there is not just a content base, but there's also a real world or cultural connection in the objective, all right? And so we are going to there's a hand raised, and then we're going to give a scientific example for our science teachers who we left out on Wednesday. Michelle.
Yep.
I was wondering, how do you, when you're looking at these strategies, how as when you're making or writing out your scope for the year, how do you ensure that these are accurate? So for example, number 2, when it says problem solving for real world issues, how do we ensure teachers are aligning it to issues that are relevant to our communities based on what's relevant to our children, not from their own perception or their own bias?
Absolutely. So for one, here's the thing. Knowing that right now when teachers are just, using materials, the materials already have bias in them. So know that even when we don't have teachers recreating anything, we just have them just using whatever, there's already bias in it. Having sessions like this and talking about these different things and uncovering these biases about different groups helps teachers be able to identify these biases when they're actually pulling out the material and creating the material. And so having sessions like this helps them be able to understand that this is biased, that this is inaccurate. And so therefore it fine tunes their eye to be able to pick out better materials. And number 3, honestly, as I was teaching our teachers to do this, it took a lot of support. So as they're recreating these things, they should not be creating these things in silos or all by themselves. So they always were able to say, hey, Brown, what do you think about this? And partner with other teachers to where there are multiple people kind of participating and giving information into this. And as and if you're, the dean of instruction or the principal, I was definitely going through these things with teachers, for one, to see how accurate it is and to make sure that as a school, we are moving closer to more culturally relevant curriculum and not more biased information. But I will tell you this, there are times where things get through and there are times where we mess up. And I'm going to give you one example where we messed up, where I messed up. As a principal, there was a teacher, we were talking about this and he said, okay, I want to make sure that I definitely reach out to my Muslim students who I feel like I've been overlooking. And as a person from the Christian, faith, when he was teaching history and he talked about traditions, he talked about Christianity in a very, very kind of high level. But when he talked about Islam, it was not in the same manner. And he realized that by doing that, he was actually using Christian biases that actually worked against Islam. So what did he do? And trying to do well, he had kids draw a picture of Allah and these different Muslim and these different Muslim scenes. And he was trying to just get more attention to it. But Salaam, what was the problem with that? And once again, I'm not Muslim, so I didn't know. But what was the problem in doing that?
Yeah, in many Islamic communities, having an image of God would be completely forbidden. Yeah, and so it's tone deaf to the sort of realities of the community he was actually working with.
Right, and so I had some apologizing to do. I reached out to the Muslim students in this class, you don't have to do the assignment. We're sorry about it. I reached out to their families, but here's the thing: it's not about getting it right. It's not about being right or wrong. It's about moving closer to a more inclusive community to where we are making sure that the cultures and the traditions of the people in the class are represented in our lessons and in our curriculum. So I don't want you to think that messing up, we make missteps, but it's all a part of learning. I thank God that he was actually moving closer to a place where he made sure that his Muslim students were represented and well represented. And so missteps happen, but I don't want us to think that I don't want to get it wrong. This is what this is where development comes in.
And we've got 10 minutes, Mike. And so I want to make sure that you get to the science example. And I want to respond to Minerva's somewhat questions, not really questions as well, live, just because I know other people are seeing the questions and I know other people are having internal feelings about the questions. And so I want to make sure we do have a moment to respond, but I don't want to take too much time with that because I don't think it's important to take too much time with it, but
and as a matter of fact, I see the questions. Please feel free to send an email afterwards, and we can contact, because I don't want to take everybody's time answering 1 or 2 people only. So please, for the person who's sending the questions, please let's talk right after this when everyone's dismissed. Thank you for that, because our conversation is going to be much deeper. All right, so really quickly, in looking at ELA, there's one thing we talk about when people say the classics and the canon, we talked about that. But people also say, well, look, the reason why we choose the books that we choose for ELA is because these are the popular text themes. And that's true. Individual versus society, coming of age, survival, and love. These are key themes that are found in a lot of what we call classics in literature, which is why teachers keep using it. But here's where the cultural relevance comes in. The Giver is not the only book that has the idea about individual versus society. The Catcher in the Rye is not the only coming of age story. These are the stories that people have been used to, which is why we use that. But on the right column, there are diverse texts that talk about the exact same themes. So if it's the themes that you're looking for, there are also very, very culturally diverse texts that do look more like the kids that we teach in their family experiences that talk about those exact same things. I just want to give an example. All right. And last but not least, our science example. All right, so I'm going to have, I don't know if Salaam wants to read or if we want to have one of our science teachers read, but here's a new generation science standard. And this is what it looks like to actually use some of these strategies and apply it to our current standards that we use in class.
All right. So species can, Teresa, raise your hand. Teresa, you want to read?
Let's do it, Teresa.
Sure, I'll read. It
Let's go,
says,
Teresa.
species can change over time in response to changes in environmental conditions through adaptation by natural selection acting over generations. Traits that support successful survival and reproduction in the new environment become more common.
All right, so science teachers, you're very familiar with this kind of standard. Like this is, something typical that you would have to cover in 6th to 8th grade science. But here's the interesting thing. When you look in science books, when you get to this unit where they're talking about this standard of biological adaptation, does anybody know what the main topic that science books use to teach biological adaptation? Butterflies. Butterflies. And here's the thing, it's absolutely right. Not the most interesting thing in the world. And so when you talk about biological adaptation, you can actually be more culturally relevant and say, you know what, I can really get, I can use the backgrounds of our kids and get them involved in this conversation and teach the concept as well as teach them something that might be interesting to them to learn. So here are 3 different ideas about text that you can actually use to talk about biological adaptation. Remember, you are staying true to the standards that the kids are being tested on. You're not changing the standards. You are just changing your different texts and what you're teaching to promote that standard. Salaam, if you can help me out.
Absolutely. The global distribution of skin color is the best example of adaptation. Scientists hold that human physical variations, especially traits associated with race, skin color, hair texture, and facial features, must be understood as long-range adaptations of humans in different environments. The American Association of Physical Anthropologists explains that the modern man walked out of Africa and into Europe 40,000 years ago. 8,000 years ago, man's adaptation to colder northern climates led to a loss of skin pigmentation. Skin color is due primarily to the presence of melanin. Both light and dark complexioned people have melanin. However, 2 forms are produced: pheomelanin, which is red to yellow in color, and eumelanin, which is dark brown to black. Eumelanin acts as a progressive biological shield against ultraviolet radiation, which causes nature to select for people with darker skin in tropical areas where the sun is most intense. This helps to prevent sunburn damage that can result in skin cancer or melanoma. Those with lighter skin have 10 times the higher risk than African Americans.
All right. So that's a form of biological adaptation that can be talked about. Now it's interesting because in communities of color, colorism is real. And I don't know about you, but in dealing as an African-American male, but also in dealing with the African-American students, this idea of light skin and dark skin is a real sticking point. And we learn that it's a sticking point. So to actually teach kids about their brown and dark skin actually being life-saving mechanisms, and the idea that is not negative, but it's a beautiful thing, and that your skin produced exactly what it needs to produce for the survival of people is a whole different way to be proud of who you are and proud of your skin color. We can teach this in school. We don't have to teach butterflies to talk about biological adaptation. There's another form we could talk about as well.
The prevalence of diseases has been another major factor in the evolution of human diversity, and some of the most important of human genetic variations reflect differences in immunities to diseases. For example, the introduction of sickle cell anemia to the Black community is a biological adaptation to an environmental change. Throughout areas of West Africa, like Senegal, mosquitoes carried and produced high rates of malaria and caused plague-like results on human life in that region of the continent. However, a mutation in hemoglobin later provided the West Africans with natural resistance to the disease. While this mutation provided protection from malaria, it came in the form of the sickle cell allele. Today, sickle cell anemia affects 100,000 Americans and occurs among 1 out of every 365 African American births.
So once again, another way to talk about biological adaptation that directly deals with specifically African-American students. And last but not least, and this is one that's near and dear to my heart, biological adaptation, the third version of a text that you can provide for that lesson.
You meant it is near and dear to your stomach. Lactose intolerance, which involves the individual's ability to digest milk, is another example of human biocultural evolution. In all human populations, infants and young children are able to digest milk. One ingredient of milk is lactose, a sugar that's broken down by the enzyme lactase. In most humans, the genes that code for lactase production switches off in adolescence. Once this happens, if a person drinks fresh milk, the lactose ferments in the large intestine, leading to diarrhea and severe gastrointestinal discomfort. So as you might expect, adults stop drinking fresh milk. A majority of the world's population is African and Asian. Both groups overwhelmingly struggle with digesting dairy, making most of the adult world population lactose intolerant. But in other populations, mainly those of European ancestry, adults continue to produce lactase and are able to digest fresh milk. Discontinued production of lactase is called lactase persistence.
So it's amazing when you go to school and you can learn information to pass a test or to learn content knowledge for content's sake. It's another whole extended learning experience and a richer learning experience when you're not only learning how to pass tests, but you're also learning about your body and your people and how people function. It's interesting that I had to learn this outside and never learned this in school, but I definitely had biological adaptation lessons. But once again, it was butterflies. And so always taking these kind of concepts and saying, how can I connect to my students on these topics? That is the number one way to create culturally relevant connections. And here's and if you want to go back and use something like this, when you find text like this or you recreate text like this, choice one, you can create 1 or 2 new daily objectives in the biological adaptation unit using these readings. Number 2, create 3 to 5 questions using these readings as a do now. Choice 3, create an independent practice assignment if you want to use this as the main text. And choice 4, create 2 or 3 questions as exit tickets. So this is how we turn regular standards into culturally relevant lessons for our students. At this time, I'm going to turn it over to Kari. Kari, if you want us to answer a question, we can definitely do that in the last 2 minutes. And if not, I would love to stay on with the one person who had a number of questions. I would love to stay on for extra 5 minutes with that person specifically so we can address their questions.
Yes, certainly. If you guys put it in the chat, if there's someone that really needs to get some questions off your chest,
Yes,
we can give you guys
please.
like another 2 minutes. And then we will close this up. We really appreciate everyone giving their time today. So thank you, Mike and Brother Salaam, for this presentation today. So guys, if you have any questions, throw in the chat. If not, we'll wrap it up and enjoy the rest of your weekend.
And I'm going to leave this website up. I'm sorry, I'm going to leave this link up, and these are great resources for anybody to dig into information. Once again, you got to study to get this stuff. Like we don't just have cultural relevant curriculum laying around. You actually have to create a lot of it. And so here are great sources, and we should do some of our own readings to add this into our classes.